Aloha, and welcome to SUP FM, the podcast for stand-up paddleboarders everywhere. So with no further ado, let's get out on the water and on with the show.
As we reach the end of Season 3, it's my very great pleasure to welcome someone who I've wanted on the show for a long time and who's made a huge difference to my paddle experience over the last few years. It's the author Tristan Gooley. If you haven't caught it already, me and Nick talked about Tristan back in the SUP FM Book Club episode, where we also covered some other reading that's really helped us to develop as paddlers and instructors. Tristan's books have been massive successes over the years internationally and have featured in the Sunday Times Top 10 and also the New York Times bestseller list. And it was really good of him to follow through on this interview, which we've been talking about for a while. And he's doing a load of publicity at the moment for his new book, The Secret World of Weather. I've always spent time in and around nature, but his books have really opened my eyes to things I'd never previously been aware of. And on dry land, his books like The Natural Navigator can help you to see simple patterns in nature that you can use practically and to help to deepen that really crucial fix of nature, which, as we know, is so important for our mental health. But in this interview, we talk about his book, How to Read Water, which, in my view, is a must-have for anyone who spends time on the water. And it's a book which covers every water environment, inland and the ocean. And it gives you some great tips and practical knowledge to use wherever you are in the world, and whether you're on the water or if you're just planning to get out. This interview is slightly shorter than usual because Tristan was in demand as he releases his new book, and we fly very quickly through a very small number of the subjects he covers in his book, and I attempt to talk Tristan through one of the lessons that I've used most often when I'm lining up a surf session, which is how to tell the wave height while standing on the beach. So this is the last episode of Season 3. And if you enjoyed the season, if you enjoy the podcast, please give us some love on social media and let us know what your favourite episode was and why. But in the meantime, here's a guest whose book, How to Read Water, is one I can't say enough about and which I highly, highly recommend. Here's Tristan Gooley. So Tristan, welcome to SUP FM. You've been really busy over the last 12 months. You've got a new book out soon, which we'll talk about later. For people who don't know about you and who haven't discovered your books, you're an expedition leader. You've taken part and done some sort of pretty gritty challenges, including crossing the Atlantic a couple of times, both times solo, I think, one by plane, one by sail. But you're most known for publishing a number of books on natural navigation. Now, how would you describe natural navigation and how did you first get into it?
Natural navigation is the wonderful art of finding our way using nature, and that nutshell does sort of encapsulate the idea, but it doesn't actually do the subject justice, because my experience with it led me to, from a sort of very simple nuts and bolts, how do I find direction using sun, moon, stars, waves, wind, clouds, to quite a sort of seismic shift, which feels at times philosophical, at times practical, at times, a third space, where absolutely everything outdoors is a sign and a clue. And that is it was a very organic process. So natural navigation is the art of finding our way using nature, but that is a sort of, it's an umbrella, and underneath that sits this idea that for those of us who enjoy deduction, mysteries and puzzles, natural navigation is shorthand for, I want to understand what's going on out there. I want to find meaning in every little thing that my senses feed to me.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny because that's exactly the way that I tend to explain it to people. You're a bit like the nature equivalent of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes interprets all these various clues that are out there that people just walk by and they don't necessarily notice. And it's something that's been particularly important, during the times that we've been living through at the moment, because we're going deep into things rather than sort of jetting all over the world. And it gives us an experience where we're able to interpret and look at nature in a much more comprehensive way.
Yes, I think that the Sherlock Holmes analogy, I think, is an interesting one, and it's interesting on a couple of levels. One of them is cultural, and I think my work is about fundamental things, fundamental patterns in nature, but also our fundamental psychology. If we compare ourselves to the animal kingdom, we are slower, with weaker senses, weaker physically than, we generally on a physical level will get out competed by most species in some way or another. But the one thing we do have over pretty much all other species, as far as we can tell so far, is an ability to solve mysteries and deduce things. But what's interesting culturally is that we need to use a modern. I mean, in terms of nature, Sherlock Holmes is incredibly modern. In terms of literature, it's getting on a tiny bit, but we use these modern cultural analogies to understand something that is age old, and that's quite often the best way to do it. It's quite hard to describe the way we think and feel as animals whose genes haven't changed for tens of thousands of years potentially. That's almost too deep to go straight into. So I actually the Sherlock Holmes thing is a fun sort of pop cultural way of saying this is the kind of stuff that your brain is going to be doing if you get into natural navigation. And I think everybody understands it straight away. But to me, it is still quite interesting that we're using modern, very modern, in that case, quite sort of urban examples to describe something that's probably 100,000 years older or more, and not just rural but wild.
Absolutely. So How to Read Water is the book, obviously, that we're going to focus on today. And as I mentioned, that was a New York Times bestseller. But I think there's, just to sort of illustrate what we mean by natural navigation. And I think it's important to point out also that to utilise your books, you don't have to necessarily be in the UK or living on the coast or in the countryside. You can be in the northern or southern hemisphere, and you can even use these sorts of things in an urban setting. But before we get into talking about the water, there's a classic shore-based navigation tip that I know you've spoken about quite a lot, and it's the thing that really started me off and got me dialed into what natural navigation is about and how simple those signs are that we tend to just walk past us. So could you just explain how you can look at a tree and work out compass directions from it?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I think the tree is it's a great way in. And just before I go into the detail of the how-to, it's a really good example because the word tree everybody understands instantly and doesn't require identification. The second you're mentioning species names and things like that, I think more than half the people go, this is for, I like to refer to tribes. I'm not talking about indigenous tribes. Sometimes I am, but generally I'm just talking about groups of people and how they identify and how they feel. So if you use a species name, one large tribe of people go, that's for a different tribe. That's not for me. Whereas if you say tree, everyone goes, yeah, I'm still on the page, sometimes literally. So in the case of a tree, what's great is the patterns apply to the vast majority of tree species. It's a fundamental thing. And trees, unlike animals, can't move. So if a tree isn't, I'll anthropomorphize it a bit. I'm doing it deliberately. I don't believe a tree has a brain or a central nervous system, obviously, but in terms of conveying concepts and teaching things, it is quite a helpful device. So if a tree's not happy with its lot, it can't, like an animal, move 100 meters or 100 miles to improve its situation. So the only thing it can do is respond primarily with growth changes. And what we find is actually the result of the way the tree grows in response to light, water, wind, and a few other variables is actually quite simple, and it leads to very simple patterns. The simplest of which is you get more tree on the southern side. But every single part of a tree and every single part of anything growing is responding. So what we end up doing is putting two quite simple bolts together. We get most of our light from the south because the sun is due south in the middle of the day in the northern hemisphere, well, north of the tropics. Trees are responding to that. It's very asymmetrical. They're not getting much light from the north. So their evolutionary response is, I want more of the light. It's my breakfast, lunch and dinner. I'm going to grow more out in that direction. what we then find is that there are more than 20 of these types of responses. So that's the simplest one. But the shape of the branches, the way leaves grow, the colours all through a tree are also reflecting these inputs, and through that giving us clues to direction and many other things too.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I love about your books is the sense of reconnecting with a lot of lost and ancient skills and knowledge, which people tend to get from obviously a lack of technology, but also a really deep immersion into their local area where there wasn't all the distractions of modern life. And you spent a lot of time on expeditions with Indigenous people to understand their traditions, and also researching the Westerners who have also done the same thing. And in the book, How to Read Water, you talk about Pacific Islanders and their incredible navigation abilities. Now, stand-up paddle owes everything really to these Polynesian and Micronesian cultures, which really created this sport. So could you just tell us a little bit about some of their methods of navigating?
Yes, they've been such an inspiration to me, and it's a by and large a happy story. The way the West learnt about these skills. So the Pacific Islanders grew up in their own isolated navigational culture. Now, navigation, and in their case, natural navigation, they had no tools of any description for finding direction or working out where they were, was essential in a way that was different to the Western experience. Most Western cultures, sort of land based, and going to sea was part of a whole list of things that were optional. Whereas in the Pacific, if you didn't go to sea, there was really no life to speak of, because quite often the communities are too small to survive in the numbers they were on a single island. So that forced a massive engagement with the sea, and when you combine that with the lack of technology, they were shielded, which I don't know if that is the right word, but they were cut off from the sort of technological arms race which has been going on. So the Vikings and the Arabs were constantly at each other's throats for a period. And when one culture invented something, it was probably only a matter of weeks, if not weeks, months, before a boat was overtaken by the other culture, and that technology transferred. But that didn't happen in the Pacific. So what we find is this wonderful cultural ecosystem where they had no choice but to take these skills to the highest possible level. And the skills we're talking about here are mainly patterns in water behaviour. So, and it's a very on so many levels, it's been inspirational and formative for me. But the one that's most relevant to me and how I wrote this book was that when the wind blows water, as all your listeners will know, we get ripples. If it blows for long enough, we get waves. And if there's a massive amount of energy coming from the wind into the water, a storm or very strong wind systems, then swell is formed. And swell, as you will be aware, is wave energy that's travelled beyond the point where it's created. Now, when those waves of any size, but swell is the most pertinent in the Pacific, bump into an obstacle, certain patterns are formed, and they are formed dependably. We're talking about laws of nature here. It's not a kind of subjective mood type thing. The wave doesn't hit an island and then sort of go, oh, today I feel like sort of doing a star-shaped pattern. It creates the same patterns every time. The simplest thing being there'll be some reflection, but then we move into areas that are a little bit more, interesting and perhaps complex, where they bend round refraction. They overlap on the downwind side, and there's a swell shadow where the waves don't get, and that just creates five patterns that are recognisable. Now, from the perspective of the Pacific Islanders, they're picking this up from being very close to it, being on the surface of it. So they're quite often picking it up through motion, and there are many sort of stories of the islanders lying on the decks of their outrigger canoes with their eyes shut to focus on that sense of motion, and being able to work out where land is just from that change in rhythm. And I've been aware of that for decades. But what the trigger for the book was actually there was a moment when I saw these patterns the wind was blowing across a pond near where I lived in Sussex, and it set up some ripples, and the ripples bumped into a clump of lilies in the middle of this pond. And I saw the same patterns And they were identical to the patterns that I'd seen in research that had been done in the Pacific and things like that. And at that moment, I realised that not only were these patterns dependable, but they were universal. Where wind on any scale touches water on any scale, you'll get waves. And where those waves bump into something, you will find these patterns. And it genuinely doesn't matter if it's 3 or 4 meters or 300 or 400 miles. You're going to get. You'll have to forgive my mixing metric and imperial. It's one of my vices, but that's the truth. It's happening on all scales, and that for me was so exciting, because I thought, if this stuff resides in the Pacific, it is fascinating, doubly fascinating to the people out there, and in an academic sense, fascinating to us. But the moment I realised that actually we could pretty much see it in the Bath, that's when I thought, wow. Okay, what other patterns are true? What other ones? Can we carry with us all through the world and on all scales?
Absolutely. And for stand-up paddleboarders, obviously it's a very basic type of water propulsion. And one of the features, particularly of those of us who paddle on the water and on the sea, that sort of emotion and that feeling of being at one with the water is certainly something that we would identify with. The Polynesians use other methods as well. There's the wind compass. I mean, that again is a fascinating one, particularly identify with that one over the last sort of couple of weeks where we've had easterlies, but just sort of identify a little bit about a wind compass and how they work with those.
Yes, the word compass in the context of Pacific navigators is sometimes misused, because our understanding of a compass is something that gives you information, whereas the compass in that context is quite often referred to the use of understanding what's going on around you and working back from that. So a lot of natural navigation is to do with wind awareness. It's one of the first things I teach people, and I refer to it in writing a lot, is you're tuning into the wind today and developing a relationship with the medium and long-term patterns wherever you are. And again, that happens over several scales. So in the UK, for example, we have prevailing southwesterlies. Put another way, if you had to put a bet on what the wind will be doing in 6 months' time, bet on a southwesterly. You could well be wrong. It could be from the north. As you said, we've had easterlies, but it's just a percentage thing. And in the Pacific, that's again, like all of these skills, it's taken to another level, awareness of seasonal winds and those relationships with the swell. So a classic sort of journey to an island might involve an awareness that the seasonal winds were from one direction, but actually there's been a storm generating swell coming from another direction, and that's giving you, instead of it being confusing, it actually is giving you two layers, and they reinforce each other. And these patterns are just ripped through nature the whole way. So, for example, when I was crossing Dartmoor quite a few years ago, I knew where the wind was coming from on the day. I knew the prevailing wind direction was from the southwest, and I knew what the wind had been doing over previous days. So I could actually see the grasses bent over different periods of time and feel the wind on my face, which is totally analogous to the Pacific method of knowing what the wind is doing on that day and actually having a history of what the wind has been doing in the swell that's moving the boat as well.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the real sort of practical applications of some of the things that you cover, because your book covers so many different areas. You talk about water in all its forms, all the way from what I'd say the surprisingly fascinating world of puddles, which is a phrase that I never thought in my life I would say, but it is fascinating. But you cover puddles, lakes, rivers, obviously the coast, because in water terms there's so much to cover there, weather signs, star navigation, light on water. And so whatever area you paddle, there's something for you in this book. But just to start with rivers, there are a lot of features there, and one of them has a fantastic name, the Talweg. What is the Talweg, and in terms of navigating a river, why is it so significant?
The Talweg is the deepest point in any valley, and that's particularly interesting in terms of water flow. And it's true of a dry valley. So you can have a Talweg in a valley where no water's running, or water might be seasonal. So it's not referring to the water itself. It's referring to that line of the deepest line that you could trace in any valley. And then when water's flowing through it and we have a river, the towweg becomes even more interesting because the water will flow fastest on or very close to the towweg. Everybody will be familiar with the idea that water behaves differently as it gets shallower. The wave behaviour in coastal situations is hugely changed. But in terms of river, speed is one of the big differences. As it gets shallower, the friction is greater, and the water moves more slowly at the edges. So what most people would do, and I use the game of poo sticks, which I've given talks about this book in the UK, the US, and a few other places, and it's a slightly sort of Anglo-centric sort of view of things. So if anyone's listening who's in the UK, poo sticks is based on the Winnie the Pooh books. It's a game where you throw sticks off a bridge on the upstream side, and whoever stick comes out first on the downstream side wins the game. And I use that to kind of illustrate the idea that most people, even if they've spent very little time on or near the water, will probably have some idea that you're more likely to win the game if you drop your stick near the middle. But I make the joke that actually you can win a bet and wipe the smile off an 8-year-old's face by knowing the towweg, because every natural river bends. No river can run straight for more than 10 times its own width without human engineering. So what we find is where there's a bend, the towweg is naturally, just because of natural forces, is closer to the outside bend. So putting all those small pieces together, what we find is find the middle of the river. And then just move ever so slightly towards the outside bend, and the water will be moving slightly faster. And in the research for this book, I'm observing things, I'm noticing things, and I'm then going away scratching my head, and then I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And so when I'm spotting these sorts of things, I'm going like, wait a minute, it isn't fastest in the middle there. I'm not sort of thinking, right, okay, well, I need to spend 10 years staring at that river. I will go very happily and sort of bow down at coxes on rowing boats and people who have spent 10 years trying to work out where the water is fastest. And that's kind of the process of my work quite often. Is I notice something, it makes me curious, and then I gratefully accept that somebody's probably spent 10 years more thinking about that individual sign than me, and I stand on their shoulders and borrow it for the book.
Absolutely, and we harvest that information from your book. Just moving on to the coast. So my first sailing experience, I was in a little race, and I was amazed by the skipper's ability to be able to anticipate the arriving winds just before they arrived. Could you just tell us a little bit about what sort of visual signs they were looking out to help them with that?
Yes, I think the sign you're referring to there are a few that can help, but the main one is the nickname is cat's paws, and when wind is flowing over water, it's not perfectly smooth. There's some turbulence there, and that means that the wind doesn't touch the water in a uniform way. And there are places where the wind is touching the water more aggressively, and places where it's sort of moving over smoothly and not really disturbing the water. And the places and gusts of wind tend to be quite sort of rough and turbulent, and they it's almost like they scratch the water surface, and that creates this effect that has the lovely nickname of cat's paws. And I had a similar experience to you when I was learning, and then occasionally I get sort of reminded of it. If you're the smaller the sailboat you're in, the more you pay attention to these sorts of signs. If you're in a sort of 100-foot boat, you generally get away with reacting to gusts, whereas if you're in something that's not that much longer than your tool, you have to preempt them. And so what we find is when there's a gust, it scratches at the water, and visually all that is a change of colour. Typically, we're seeing quite a bright sort of surface because we're seeing mainly reflections of the sky, and where that gets roughed up a bit and scratched by these cat's paws, we see a darkening. But it will always be different because the effect is it's sort of slightly breaking the mirror in that place, or certainly giving you reflections of a different thing, or breaking the reflection. So we don't actually have to work out what we're seeing. We just notice these patches of colour change. And once you're practiced in doing it, it's with most of these signs, there's a quite early tipping point where we start actively looking for them, going, can I actually spot that, or is this for somebody else? And then we go, wait, I've spotted it. And then what happens is you do it a few times, and because our brain has evolved to spot patterns, we are so good at spotting patterns that it's notorious the brain will find patterns where there are none. So actually, the problem's at the opposite end. But in terms of spotting signs, it's great, because that is one of the things our brain is brilliant at taking a bit of sensory information. A colour change, I know what that means. You probably only have to see it half a dozen times before the meaning will leap to you. You go, that's a gust. So it starts with, is that a cat's paw? Oh, yeah, maybe that. Yeah, I think, there's a gust of wind. Half a dozen times of that, and then your brain will just say, look, don't do all that hard work thinking. When you see that colour change, you're about to get hit by a gust.
And you may well not know the answer to this, as you've written it rather than reading it, but all of your books are so packed full of useful information. The challenge is often at retaining it enough so that when you go out for your walk or out on the water, you actually notice these things. My tactic is to restrict myself to just concentrate on a very tight section of the book and then go out and look for those patterns, because otherwise I just go from one interesting fact to the other. I don't know whether there's any best practice for properly integrating your knowledge into the real world.
Well, thanks. It's a lovely compliment, and I know exactly what you mean. And the way I sort of suggest people do this, particularly if they're new to these things, is my job is almost like a sort of host of a cocktail party, and each of these signs is a character, and I will introduce you to several hundred of them, but I'm not expecting you to like them or want to form a relationship with all of them. So that's very much what happens with me personally. I mean, over the years I got to know all of them. I don't love all of them, but I find them all interesting, and again, it's a tribal thing, by which I mean some people just find the wind interesting, and some people find rainbows interesting, and some people find rivers more interesting than the coast, etc., etc. So my job is I take you to continue that metaphor analogy. I take you into the room and just say, these are the characters, these are the signs. You go out there and do what you're doing. That's your thing, and what you'll spot some of these characters, and you will hopefully form a bond with some of them. Might not be love at first sight. One or two of them it is. There's one called the glitter path, where we can tell how big the waves are because the reflection of the sun near sunrise or sunset broadens when the waves get bigger. That's one people quite often fall in love with very quickly. But there are others that are a bit more technical. Bit like being introduced to a geek at a party. It's kind of like, not everybody's cup of tea, but some people are going to love them, some people are going to let them be, and that's all I suggest is meet them all once, and then you choose which ones you want to spend time with.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's particularly interesting to stand-up paddlers is conditions, obviously closer to shore. And there's a place near me, which is a place where lots of Instagram pictures get taken. It's called Old Harry Rocks. It's sort of stacks and so on out into the sea. And it's the start of the Jurassic coast of Dorset, which is an absolutely beautiful area. But like a lot of these really spectacular areas, that there are potential risks in that area, particularly overfalls. Could you just explain a bit about overfalls and how they work and the role of the tide where it comes to connecting with them?
Yes, I think in the book I describe an experience I had sailing with a friend, and I had a 32-foot sailing boat called Contessa 32, which for non-sailors, the way I describe it is it's the Land Rover Defender of the sea. It can take on pretty much anything, but it's not very comfortable. But I went with my friend, and we deliberately went through overfalls, which is a stupid thing to do. But so overfalls, most will be familiar, but it's when you've got water flows horizontally over a very rough seabed. The rougher the seabed and the faster the water, and depth plays a part as well. If above a certain depth, in the middle of the Atlantic, we don't suddenly feel the trenches at the bottom. So if water is shallow enough, I mean, it can still be deep in terms of our experience. It could still be sort of 10 meters or something like that, but it's shallow enough relative to the seabed, and the water flows fast over that. You get a lot of turbulence at the surface, and I think the analogy I use in the book is those times when you're kind of you're washing up and the tap's flowing fast and it goes over the surface of a plate, and that's all smooth, and you can kind of predict exactly what the water's going to do. But if you suddenly start washing up a grater, it starts flying everywhere. You get wet and you think, I need to turn the tap down or whatever. But really, all fluids, liquids and gases, have these two modes. They're either smooth or they're turbulent. The scientists call it laminar flow or turbulent flow. So overfalls are just where the water's moving quite quickly because of tides. Typically round headlands where it accelerates, it's a little bit like a thumb over the end of the hose. So you've got fast water in terms of the scheme of the ocean as a whole. It's quite shallow because you're near the coast. Going over, it can be underwater caves. There can be rocks. In the area you're talking about, the coast is constantly sort of falling into the sea. So historically, that's probably a large part of the reason there. There's a lot of sort of big chunks of debris that have fallen off cliffs and things like that. And it just is if you're expecting it and it's part of the plan, it's a rough and exciting ride. If it catches you off guard, it's dangerous and truly terrifying.
I'm a stand-up paddle surfer, and one of my favourite and most useful tips that I've got from your book is your method to tell the height of a wave from the beach. Would you like to just quickly talk us through that method?
Yes, I probably won't do it justice because I haven't sort of had to describe it for a while, and it's a good example of the sort of thing where I probably spent quite a while trying to get it down to something that made sense in the book. But it's are you talking about the horizon one?
Yes, yeah.
Why don't you tell me how you know? I mean, because it's more important the listeners are happy with it, and it's clearly fresh in your mind. So you tell me how you remember it, and I think it'll be better than the job I do.
It's one of the difficult things about podcasts where, because of the medium, sometimes it's better to actually read it and actually look at it, particularly if it's a diagram. But let me give it a go. So basically, if you're standing on the beach and there are waves breaking ahead of you, you can assess the height of them by walking down the beach. Obviously, beaches shelve, and you can walk down the beach to a point where you can line up the horizon with the top of the breaking wave. Now, if you have reached that point without your feet getting wet, then that's an indicator then that the waves are higher than you, they're taller than you. And to get a decent idea of what the actual height of the waves are, you sort of take your height and then add on the sort of the clearance between where your feet are and where the water starts. So that would be how you would identify waves that are bigger than you. Now, obviously, if you've managed to walk all the way down to the beach, down to the sea edge, and if you still haven't sort of aligned your eye level with the top of the waves and the horizon, then that will then mean that the wave height is shorter than you. So you can adjust your surf trip accordingly.
I was right. That's far better than I would have done. It also allowed me a sip of tea, which I was quite grateful for. So thank you very much, Simon. That was a good job.
No problem. Well, there's lots of stuff in the book that I wanted to cover, but time is marching on. So some of the things that we haven't covered, I wanted to talk about Corryvreckan, which is a massive whirlpool up in Scotland, and one of my previous guests had a rather close encounter with that, which on a paddleboard wasn't particularly great. And also transit points, which is another seagoing method of navigation. And of course, the other thing is navigation using stars. And again, you give a very good explanation of how to work out the location of Polaris, the northern star, which has caused great entertainment. It's really great to figure that out. But obviously, paddleboarders are hugely sensitive to weather conditions, and obviously you've mentioned the wind there. But your book, I believe, which is coming out in April in the UK, deals with weather conditions. It's called The Secret World of Weather. Could you just tell us a little bit about what we can look forward to reading about in that book?
Yes, thanks for mentioning that, Simon. It's whenever we look at a weather forecast, the meteorologists are leaning on centuries of experience in the professional body of knowledge and some of the most powerful computers in the country and some very clever models to produce a sketch of what the weather will be doing. But by and large, they're talking about the weather that's 50 to 100 feet above your head. And the reason is that they can't produce something that is relevant to each of us individually. But we are all moving through our own little microclimates. So it doesn't actually matter if you're walking through a city or if you're in the ocean or if you're in a wild patch. What is going on around you, the things you can observe, will change the weather you can experience. They will change the amount of sun, wind, water. They'll change the clouds. So each of these individual sort of cloud, wind, and other signs is very, very local, but you'll never ever hear it. So the reason I called it The Secret World is we move through this world. It's under our noses. Some of these signs we can physically touch, but you won't hear them referred to in a weather forecast ever. So it's like all my work. It's clues and signs, but it's that sudden gust of wind. What does that actually mean? That's a gap wind. Okay, but what about that one? That's a different one. That's the cold air coming down off that hill over there. So that again, there are hundreds of them. People won't necessarily love every single one of them, but hopefully there'll be enough in there for some new relationships to form.
That sounds like a wonderful book, very much something which would be of interest to our paddleboard community. Tristan, thank you so much. Really appreciate you giving up your time. I know you've got a very busy time at the moment. Where can we find out more about you?
Thanks so much for having me, Simon. And I've got a website, naturalnavigator.com, which allows you to kind of explore themes. It can be reading water, it can be weather, it can be stars, it can be all sorts of things. Lots of examples on there. I'm on social media, the usual places. The Natural Navigator on Instagram, Natural Nav on Twitter, and I can't remember on Facebook. I've got a newsletter which you can subscribe to via the website, where I sort of set puzzles and add sort of clues and little mysteries to solve as well. Lots of information there on the books and the online course as well. So have an explore of naturalnavigator.com. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Tristan. Hopefully at some point we could lure you out on a paddleboard on the River Arun.
I'd make the pros listening to this laugh. I'm not the world's most natural boarder, but I do enjoy it. My wife's a lot better, but I don't let her know that. But we have fun together.
Fabulous. Thanks ever so much, Tristan. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you to Tristan, and a massive thank you to you for listening to this episode and for listening to the SUP FM podcast. And if you want to get a proper written explanation of how to gauge wave height from the shore, or a load of other useful water signs you can use whenever you paddle, then check out Tristan's book, available everywhere, and we've also linked to it in the show notes. This season started way back in early October, and because there have been some major changes over the past few months, there's been a lot of juggling going on in the background to keep these episodes coming. So before the launch of the fourth season, we need to do a bit of a housekeeping and updating, and of course to add to the safety course. So please follow the SUP FM podcast on Apple or Google Podcast or on Spotify. Like us on Facebook, and a big mahalo to everyone for supporting and listening this far. And hopefully as things unwind and get better, we'll see you on the water, and if not, we'll see you back for season 4. Take care.